The journey to Pelican Bay State Prison does not begin with a sentence handed down in a courtroom. It begins quietly, deep inside California's prison bureaucracy, where decisions are made behind closed doors and paperwork determines who will be sent to one of the most isolated and restrictive prisons in the United States. For inmates, the transfer to Pelican Bay is not announced publicly. There is no warning countdown, no official explanation, and no chance to challenge the decision in real time. One day, a prisoner is housed in a general population yard or a lower security unit. The next, their name appears on a confidential transfer list, and their life changes permanently. Pelican Bay State Prison was built for a specific purpose. Opened in 1989 near the Oregon border, it was designed to house California's most disruptive, violent, and influential inmates. The prison's location was intentional. Surrounded by dense forest, cold coastal fog, and miles of isolation, Pelican Bay was meant to cut inmates off not just from society, but from other prisons. Transfers there are not routine. They are calculated moves within a system focused on control, intelligence, and long-term containment. The process begins with classification. Every inmate in California's prison system is constantly evaluated using a complex scoring system that measures behavior, criminal history, disciplinary violations, gang associations, and perceived threat level. A single violent incident may not be enough to trigger a transfer. Instead, it is patterns that matter. Repeated rule violations, suspected leadership roles within prison gangs, possession of contraband weapons, or involvement in coordinated disturbances can place an inmate on a watch list. These evaluations are conducted by institutional classification committees, groups of officials who review case files and make recommendations that follow inmates throughout their incarceration. What makes Pelican Bay different is that many transfers are not tied to new crimes or visible violence. Intelligence plays a major role. California's prison system operates a vast internal intelligence network, tracking communications, tattoos, associations, and coded behavior. An inmate may never be caught committing a violent act, yet still be labeled a security threat based on intercepted messages or informant testimony. Once that label is applied, it is difficult to remove. Transfers to Pelican Bay often follow these determinations, justified as preventative rather than punitive. Gang validation has historically been one of the most controversial pathways to Pelican Bay. For decades, inmates identified as members or associates of prison gangs could be transferred to Pelican Bay's Security Housing Unit, or SHU, without ever committing a violent offense inside prison. Possession of certain drawings, books, letters, or symbols was sometimes enough to support validation. Critics argued that this system relied heavily on confidential informants and vague criteria, creating a pipeline to long-term isolation with little oversight. While reforms have reduced the use of indefinite SHU confinement, Pelican Bay remains a destination for inmates deemed impossible to manage elsewhere. Once a transfer is approved, the inmate is rarely informed in advance. Transfers are often executed suddenly to prevent resistance or coordinated responses. In many cases, inmates are told only hours before movement, sometimes after being placed in restraints. Personal property is inventoried quickly, and anything deemed excessive or unauthorized is discarded or stored indefinitely. Legal documents may be packed hastily, increasing the risk of loss. Family members are not notified until after the transfer is complete, leaving loved ones unaware of where the inmate has been taken. Transportation itself is tightly controlled. Prisoners transferred to Pelican Bay are typically moved during early morning hours. Shackles, waist chains, and handcuffs are standard. High-risk inmates may be fitted with additional restraints designed to limit movement and communication. Transport vehicles are unmarked or minimally labeled, escorted when necessary, and routed to avoid public attention. Stops are limited, and inmates remain restrained throughout the journey. For some transfers, helicopters are used to reduce transit time and minimize risk. The psychological impact of the transfer begins long before arrival. Inmates are acutely aware of Pelican Bay's reputation. Stories circulate through prison yards about permanent isolation, sensory deprivation, and endless fog pressing against concrete walls. Even inmates accustomed to high-security environments often describe the transfer as a breaking point. The knowledge that they are being removed from familiar surroundings and sent to an institution designed for long-term containment creates immediate stress and fear. Upon arrival, the intake process is cold and efficient. New arrivals are searched, photographed, medically screened, and assigned housing based on classification. For many, that means placement in restricted housing units where movement is tightly controlled and human contact is minimal. Cells are designed to prevent communication. Doors are solid steel. Windows are narrow. Exercise, when permitted, takes place alone in concrete enclosures. This is not a temporary holding phase for many inmates. Transfers to Pelican Bay are often intended to be long-term solutions. The secrecy surrounding transfers is deliberate. Officials rarely disclose detailed reasons for individual placements, citing security concerns. Appeals processes exist on paper, but they move slowly and rarely result in immediate change. Inmates may spend years at Pelican Bay while their classification status is reviewed again and again, often with the same conclusions repeated. The burden of proof rests on the inmate to demonstrate reduced threat, a difficult task in an environment that offers few opportunities for behavioral improvement. Critics argue that the transfer system prioritizes control over rehabilitation. By removing inmates deemed problematic and isolating them, prisons elsewhere reduce immediate disturbances, but the underlying issues remain unresolved. Supporters counter that Pelican Bay is necessary to protect staff and other inmates, serving as a last resort for those who cannot be safely housed elsewhere. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, shaped by decades of evolving policy, legal challenges, and public scrutiny. What is rarely discussed publicly is how many inmates transferred to Pelican Bay were never convicted of new crimes, never attacked staff, and never led riots. Some were labeled threats based on associations formed years earlier. Others were transferred after disputes with prison staff escalated through disciplinary channels. Once the transfer occurs, reversing it becomes a long and uncertain process, often dependent on flawless behavior within an environment designed to limit interaction. For families, the transfer is devastating. Pelican Bay's remote location makes visitation difficult, expensive, and infrequent. Communication is limited. Phone calls are restricted. Letters may take weeks to arrive. For many inmates, the transfer effectively cuts them off from their support systems, increasing isolation and mental strain. Former inmates have described the feeling as being buried alive within the prison system, removed from sight, and slowly forgotten. Despite reforms and court rulings aimed at reducing extreme isolation, Pelican Bay continues to receive inmates through this opaque transfer process. The criteria may have evolved, but the underlying structure remains. Decisions are made internally, justified through security language that is rarely challenged successfully. For inmates on the receiving end, the transfer marks the beginning of a new phase of incarceration defined by restriction, surveillance, and uncertainty. And this is only the beginning of the story. Because what happens after inmates arrive at Pelican Bay, how they are housed, monitored, and kept there, reveals even more about why this prison remains one of the most feared destinations in the California prison system. Once inmates settle into Pelican Bay, the reality of the transfer becomes clear. This is not simply another high-security prison. The architecture itself is a form of control. Cells are built to limit sensory input and communication. Walls are thick concrete. Doors are solid steel with narrow slots. Sound does not travel easily, and visibility is intentionally restricted. Inmates often describe the environment as timeless, where days blur together without meaningful markers. This design is not accidental. Pelican Bay was engineered to neutralize influence, especially from inmates suspected of coordinating activity across prison systems. Housing assignments are critical. Many transferred inmates are placed in restricted housing units where movement is scheduled, monitored, and limited to the bare minimum. Meals are delivered through slots. Recreation, if permitted, takes place alone in small concrete yards with walls instead of open space. Human contact is reduced to brief interactions with staff, often through barriers. For inmates accustomed to general population, this shift is immediate and disorienting. The absence of noise, conversation, and physical movement becomes its own form of pressure. Correctional staff at Pelican Bay operate under strict protocols. Every movement requires authorization. Escorts are common, even for short distances. Officers are trained to limit verbal engagement, maintaining professional distance at all times. This environment shapes behavior on both sides. Inmates quickly learn that any perceived infraction, no matter how minor, can result in further restriction. Staff, in turn, are conditioned to view inmates primarily through the lens of threat assessment rather than rehabilitation. The transfer's justification often becomes clearer during these early weeks. Intelligence units monitor communication closely. Mail is reviewed. Phone calls are recorded. Inmates suspected of ongoing gang involvement or coordination are flagged quickly. Even vague language or coded references can trigger reports. This surveillance is continuous, reinforcing the sense that Pelican Bay is less a prison and more a containment facility designed to disrupt influence networks. Mental health becomes a central issue almost immediately. Extended isolation has well-documented psychological effects, including anxiety, depression, paranoia, and cognitive decline. While mental health services exist on paper, access is limited and often reactive rather than preventative. Inmates must request evaluations, and appointments may be brief or delayed. Critics argue that the system identifies mental health deterioration only after it becomes severe, rather than addressing it proactively. For inmates seeking transfer out of Pelican Bay, the path is narrow and slow. Behavioral reviews are conducted periodically, but progress is measured under restrictive conditions. Demonstrating reduced threat requires consistent compliance over long periods. Yet opportunities to show positive behavior are minimal. Programs are limited. Social interaction is controlled. Education and work assignments, common pathways to lower classification elsewhere, are often unavailable. This creates a paradox where inmates are expected to improve without the tools typically used to demonstrate improvement. Legal challenges have shaped Pelican Bay's operations over the years, particularly regarding long-term isolation. Court rulings forced changes to gang validation practices and reduced the use of indefinite confinement. However, the prison remains a destination for inmates classified as high risk, and transfers continue under revised criteria. The language has shifted, but the outcome is often the same: removal from the general population and placement in one of the most controlled environments in the state. Transfers to Pelican Bay also serve a broader strategic function within California's prison system. By isolating individuals believed to exert influence, officials aim to disrupt networks that span multiple facilities. This containment strategy reduces immediate violence elsewhere, but concentrates pressure within Pelican Bay itself. Tension does not disappear, it is relocated. Former staff have described the prison as a pressure chamber, absorbing individuals deemed too difficult to manage in other institutions. Communication with the outside world remains limited. Visitation requires extensive planning due to Pelican Bay's remote location. Families often travel hundreds of miles, navigating strict schedules and security procedures for brief visits. For many inmates, these visits become rare or non-existent. Phone access is restricted, and mail delays are common. This isolation extends beyond physical confinement, weakening personal connections that could support rehabilitation. Over time, inmates adapt in different ways. Some withdraw completely, minimizing interaction to avoid trouble. Others attempt to navigate the system strategically, meticulously following rules in hopes of future reclassification. A few resist quietly, filing grievances and legal motions despite low success rates. Each response reflects the reality that Pelican Bay is not designed for short stays. It is structured for endurance, testing patience, resilience, and mental stability. The secrecy surrounding individual cases remains a constant source of frustration. Families and advocates often struggle to obtain clear explanations for why an inmate was transferred or how long they are expected to remain. Official responses cite safety and security concerns, offering little detail. This lack of transparency fuels suspicion and mistrust, reinforcing the perception that Pelican Bay operates beyond meaningful public oversight. What becomes evident is that the transfer itself is only the first step in a much larger process. Pelican Bay is not merely a destination. It is a mechanism within a system that prioritizes containment over clarity. Inmates sent there enter a cycle where time stretches, communication narrows, and the path forward is uncertain. And as years pass, the question shifts from why they were sent to whether they will ever leave. Because while some inmates eventually transfer out, others remain at Pelican Bay for decades. Their classification frozen, their appeals stalled, their cases quietly aging within the system. And it is in these long-term cases that the deepest secrets of California's toughest prison transfers begin to surface. For inmates who remain at Pelican Bay long-term, time takes on a different meaning. Days are structured by routine, but the lack of meaningful variation makes weeks and months blend together. Lighting remains artificial for much of the day. Outdoor exposure is limited and controlled. Weather is felt more through temperature changes than open air. This environment gradually reshapes perception, reinforcing the sense that the outside world is distant and unreachable. For many inmates, the transfer to Pelican Bay feels less like relocation and more like erasure from the broader prison system. Classification reviews continue, but they often repeat earlier conclusions. Risk assessments rely heavily on historical data, meaning past behavior can outweigh years of compliance. An inmate who was once labeled influential or dangerous may carry that designation indefinitely, even if circumstances change. This reliance on past intelligence creates a self-reinforcing cycle, where the justification for continued confinement becomes the confinement itself. Without new incidents, officials point to the original reasons. Without opportunities to demonstrate change, inmates remain defined by their worst moments. The internal culture of Pelican Bay reinforces this stasis. Rules are enforced strictly and consistently, leaving little room for discretion. Minor infractions can reset progress, delaying reviews and extending time spent in restricted housing. For inmates attempting to work toward transfer out, the margin for error is extremely narrow. One misunderstanding, one disputed report, or one procedural violation can undo months or years of compliance. This creates a constant undercurrent of anxiety, where every interaction carries potential consequences. Medical and mental health care remain ongoing points of concern. While services exist, access is tightly regulated. Appointments may occur through cell doors or behind barriers, limiting meaningful evaluation. Inmates experiencing mental health decline often struggle to articulate their needs within the constraints of the system. Isolation amplifies symptoms, making it difficult to distinguish between behavioral noncompliance and psychological distress. This ambiguity can result in disciplinary responses to what are, at their core, health issues. The impact of transfer decisions extends beyond individual inmates. Pelican Bay's role within California's prison system influences how other facilities operate. Knowing that problematic inmates can be removed to Pelican Bay affects management strategies elsewhere. Some institutions rely on the threat of transfer as a deterrent, reinforcing compliance through fear rather than engagement. This dynamic shapes inmate behavior across the system, embedding Pelican Bay into the psychological landscape of incarceration far beyond its physical walls. Public awareness of Pelican Bay has increased over time, driven by lawsuits, investigative reporting, and advocacy. Hunger strikes brought international attention to conditions inside, forcing the state to reevaluate certain practices. Policy changes followed, reducing the use of indefinite isolation and altering validation procedures. Yet despite these reforms, transfers continue, and Pelican Bay remains a symbol of the system's capacity for extreme control. The mechanisms have evolved, but the core function persists. For families, the long-term effects of transfer are profound. Relationships strain under distance, limited contact, and uncertainty. Children grow up without regular access to incarcerated parents. Elderly relatives struggle to travel. The emotional cost accumulates quietly, rarely acknowledged in official discussions of security and classification. For many families, the transfer represents not just separation, but a permanent redefinition of their connection to a loved one. Some inmates eventually leave Pelican Bay, transferred back to lower security facilities after years of compliance and review. These transitions are often slow and heavily monitored. Even after transfer, former Pelican Bay inmates may remain under heightened scrutiny, their classification history following them indefinitely. Reintegration into general population can be difficult, as social skills erode under prolonged isolation. The effects of confinement do not end at the gate. Others never leave. Their cases fade into administrative routine, reviewed periodically but rarely altered. For these inmates, Pelican Bay becomes the final chapter of incarceration, regardless of sentence length. The prison's remote location and controlled environment ensure that their stories remain largely invisible, known only through fragmented records and occasional legal filings. The system functions as designed, efficiently containing those deemed unmanageable. What emerges from this process is a broader understanding of how power operates within correctional systems. Transfers to Pelican Bay are not isolated events. They are part of a continuum that prioritizes stability, control, and risk management over transparency. Decisions are justified through security language that leaves little room for external scrutiny. Oversight exists, but it is often delayed, reactive, and constrained by institutional priorities. The secrecy surrounding transfers is not accidental. By limiting information, the system reduces opportunities for challenge. Inmates and families are left to navigate complex procedures with minimal guidance. Advocates work against timelines measured in years, not months. Meanwhile, Pelican Bay continues to receive inmates, each transfer reinforcing its role as California's ultimate containment facility. Understanding how inmates are transferred to Pelican Bay reveals more than just administrative process. It exposes a system built to isolate perceived threats at almost any cost. While safety and order are legitimate concerns, the balance between control and accountability remains contested. Pelican Bay stands at that intersection, embodying the unresolved tension between security and humanity within modern incarceration. And as long as transfers continue under this framework, Pelican Bay will remain more than a prison. It will remain a destination defined by secrecy, endurance, and the quiet permanence of decisions made far from public view.